When somebody is dying, that's not just happening to them. That's happening to all of their people, to anybody who is around or involved in that situation. And so there is a huge need or a huge room for support for everybody who's involved in that situation. And so a death doula is really there not only to provide support to that person, but to help support everybody through the entire situation.
Welcome to Nursing Beyond the Bedside. I'm Audrey, your host, and a nurse who pivoted my path several years ago. After 8 years as a critical care nurse, I was ready for change. I craved higher pay and more flexibility, but was struggling to find a clear path forward. Fast forward through positions in recruiting, customer success, and marketing, and many lessons learned along the way. Today, I run Pivot Path, a company dedicated to empowering nurses to redefine their careers. This podcast is designed to help you navigate the journey from clinical bedside nursing to a fulfilling career that aligns with your passions and goals. Here, you'll discover inspiring stories from nurses who've gone beyond the bedside, successfully transitioning to non-clinical roles, or redefining their nursing career. Join us as we hear their stories and share actionable strategies to help you make your own leap. Whether you're a new listener curious about what lies beyond the bedside, or a returning audience member in need of some fresh motivation, this podcast is your go-to resource for exploring new opportunities that can transform your career. Let's get started. Today we welcome Kacie to the show. Kacie is a Death Doula registered nurse and the visionary founder of Death Doula School. Deeply committed to transforming the end-of-life experience, Kacie blends the compassionate care of a death doula with the clinical expertise of a nurse, guiding individuals and their families through the most challenging moments with calm and clarity. As the founder and lead educator of Death Doula School, Kacie equips aspiring death doulas with the essential skills and knowledge to succeed, offering comprehensive training, community support, and ongoing mentorship. She also leads the Death Doula Collective, a nationwide network that fosters collaboration and mutual empowerment among death doulas. Kacie is recognized as a leader in the death positive movement, making significant strides in reshaping society's approach to the end of life. Kacie, it's so great to have you with us this morning.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is going to be a really great episode and conversation because I think that what you're doing is so important and so unique. So when was it that you ended up realizing that end of life care was really your passion?
I don't even know, in my nursing career, I initially started out in nursing school thinking that I wanted to work with babies, kind of at the opposite end. Like I wanted to go into labor and delivery. That's why I went into nursing in the first place. But you maybe know, when you graduate as a baby nurse, they don't really want you in labor and delivery. Understandably, they kind of want you to go out there and get some experience. And so I started working in long-term care as a new grad just to kind of get my feet wet and really see, what kind of experience I could get. And pretty quickly I learned that I really liked working with people who were more so at the end of life. So I really stuck with that. And the more I did it, the more I realized that I felt like I had a passion with this, that I was good at this, working with people who were at the end of life. And a lot of healthcare providers, nurses, and doctors even weren't always as good at working in death and end of life as I was. And so it's just kind of something that progressed. I realized in the beginning of my nursing career that I was kind of good at this, but then the more I stuck with it and the more I stuck with it, I got better at it and better at it. But then COVID really drove it home for me. I worked the front lines of COVID at a long-term care facility, and I saw hundreds of people die in a really small amount of time. But those people, they died really tragic deaths. They were in a long-term care facility where they couldn't be with their family and they didn't get to say goodbye to people. And it was COVID, so everything was crazy, and we couldn't sometimes get hospice in on time. And I was really hyper-focused in that moment and trying to help people die better. And I think that's really where it clicked for me, that this was a passion that I had, really focusing in on helping people to die a better death or giving them a better death. So that's kind of what really drove it home for me was COVID.
Yeah, wow. I mean, to your point, I don't think that as medical professionals, generally speaking, I don't think that we do death well. Like our whole job is to keep people alive and away from death. So I think that that is like an unnatural, phase of life for us as clinicians to feel comfortable providing guidance in. It's just not our specialty. And, I think that your experience through COVID, I really can't even imagine. I mean, that what a hard time for everyone involved when you are thinking about people who were dying and they couldn't have their family there with them. I mean, just so tragic. I mean, for that patient and for their families. So I think that it's really great that you saw this problem and it helped you find your passion, and now you can like go out and like really change the atmosphere around death and dying. And for the clinicians that don't know, because I think that we're all primarily familiar with hospice, tell us kind of like what the key differences are between hospice and death doulas.
Absolutely. So, hospice is clinical. Hospice handles all of the medical aspects of death and dying, and death doulas are completely non medical. So, we kind of handle everything else. We let hospice do all of the medical stuff. They handle all of the medication, all of the equipment, everything hospice does. And then death doulas come in and we provide emotional support, spiritual support, practical support, logistical support. We kind of do everything else. Hospice is limited in the amount of time that they really have to spend with people just because they've got, insurance and patients to see and all of that. So hospice kind of comes into the picture maybe 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week to see the client. Whereas death doulas, we are private pay. So we're able to be there as often or as little as the client wants. So we're able to kind of come in and provide support not only to the dying individual, but also to the loved ones. There is a big need for that because when somebody is dying, that's not just happening to them. That's happening to all of their people, to anybody who is around or involved in that situation. And so there is a huge need or a huge room for support for everybody who's involved in that situation. And so a death doula is really there not only to provide support to that person, but to help support everybody through the entire situation. So for me, I come into this situation even before hospice does, because there is a lack of knowledge and understanding and education of even what hospice is and what hospice does. And so a lot of times people don't even utilize hospice to its fullest advantage because they don't know. They don't know exactly what they can get out of hospice. And so I love to come into the picture well before somebody's even ready for hospice because I can prep them for that. I can educate them about everything that hospice can do to help us. And when they are ready for hospice, when they start kind of checking all of those boxes where now I think we're getting to the point where hospice can come in and help us now. It's really easy for me to approach that with them since we have worked together for a little while and built up a bit of a rapport. And I've been able to educate them on all of the wonderful things that hospice can do for them in that situation. Not only them, but also the loved ones too. I kind of help them to interview different hospice companies and to sign on to hospice when it's time. And then I'm just kind of there as another member of the care team, to really help with everything. So hospice is always great and wonderful, but a lot of times people still don't utilize them like they should. So hospice can come in and educate about everything they do and leave their phone numbers all over the place, but still something could go wrong and people will panic and still not know what to do. And sometimes they just need that little bit of extra handholding or support to say, I think this is one of those times where we should call the hospice nurse and get some advice from her on what she thinks we should do. And it's like, oh man, you're right. Like, why didn't I think of that? So we're just kind of there to provide that extra layer of support to really support them through everything. We do, a lot of end of life planning. Any nurse who's kind of worked with people at the end of life has likely seen things go all wrong because there's not appropriate end of life planning. And that's really, again, just because of a lack of education and knowledge surrounding end of life planning and what types of things should be in place. People don't want to think about end of life planning because they don't want to think about the end of their life and think about death. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't talk about these things and think about these things beforehand, then a lot of times situations can get really sticky and confusing and chaotic. If something suddenly happens to you or a loved one, and now your loved ones have to make choices for you that are really scary choices, and they don't know what choices you would want to make, imagine the stress that would cause for you. If your mom or your dad is suddenly unable to speak for themselves and you have to make a really scary decision for them, and you don't have any idea what decision they would want you to make. And then on top of that, maybe you make a decision, but maybe your siblings don't agree with that decision that you've made. And so now they're really mad at you. So now you've got the stress of your family member being unable to make decisions. You had to make a decision, and now everyone's mad at you on top of that. And I've seen families be torn apart over that and not even speak again, all because there just wasn't a conversation beforehand. So these are the types of things where we really love to come into the situation. And the very first thing I like to kind of get out of the way is, what type of end of life planning have we done already? And what haven't we done? Because we're going to get it out of the way. And once we get all of the planning out of the way, like physically on paper, then step number 2 is that conversation. Because not only do I want it done on paper, but I'm going to arrange a whole conversation about it with everybody. Because again, it's one thing to have it on paper, but then once it comes down to those decisions being made, people can argue and people can, I don't believe that's the decision she wanted, and whatever else. So having that conversation with everybody can really, really help to remove a lot of stress and chaos and confusion at the end. You can't argue that wasn't, her choice or her decision if those words came out of her mouth and you heard them. It just makes things go a lot smoother at the end. Talking about end of life planning and wishes, it can remove so much stress and chaos at the end. So that's kind of always step number 1, is to get all of that stuff out of the way. But then once we get all of, the legalities, if you will, all of that stuff out of the way, choosing your healthcare power of attorney and making sure you have a financial power of attorney and advanced directives and estate planning and all of that stuff. Well, then I start talking about your death plan. What do you want your last days on earth to look like? We know that life is a labor into this world, but death is also a labor out of this world. So people are usually actively dying for a period of 3 to 14 days. And when you're actively dying, you're usually unable to speak for yourself. So what do you want that to look like? Where do you want that to be? Do you want it to be at home with your things, where your pets are, in your comfortable area? How do you want it to look? Do you want us to paint the walls a prettier color than red? Do you want us to hang up pictures of your family? Do you want your pets to be around? Who do you want to be there? Are there certain people that are allowed there? Are there certain people that aren't allowed there? Is there a do not enter list? What do you want it to look like? Do we want there to be music? Do we want there to be lights on, lights off? Do you want to be by the window so you can see outside? All of these things I like to think about. I like to document. I like to talk about with the family so that we all know when this person gets to this point where they're unable to speak for themselves anymore, here's how we're going to make their last days on earth not only beautiful, but comfortable, the way that they wanted it to be. And what this does is this creates more of a beautiful memory of the person dying as opposed to a scary memory. So when people look back at losing their mom, their dad, their sister, whoever it was, they almost remember it with fondness or with beauty as opposed to fear, scary sadness, like, of course, it's always sad when you lose a loved one, but people will remember it in a different way, My mom loved the beach, and when she died, we projected waves onto the ceiling, and we had beach sounds in the background, and we misted salt water in the air, and we did this whole beach thing for her, and it was beautiful, and she would have loved every second of it, That is such a more incredible memory than looking back at her just laying in a bed, staring, and the death rattle and all of these really scary things that they might remember instead of this beautiful thing that we did for her in her last days. So these are things that death doulas do. But we also work really closely with the person to build a rapport with them. So As people are nearing the end of their life, it's so supernatural for them to want to relive their life. They want to talk about all of their memories, talk about their kids growing up and the house that they lived in and their favorite vacations. So we call this a life review. We'll talk with the person about their life. Let's relive your life. Tell me your best memories. And in doing that, oftentimes we're able to identify a way that we can create a legacy project with them. So a legacy project is a way to keep their legacy alive. So they say that each person dies two deaths, once when you physically die, and once again when you're spoken of for the last time. So what type of legacy would you like to leave behind to, keep your legacy alive, to keep people speaking of you? I can give you for instance, I had a client who was a poet. She was actually like an English teacher and she taught poetry as a professor at a college, and she had poetry that was published in books and on poetry forums. She was a poet, but she had suffered from cancer for years that had spread all over the place and spent years doing that, chemo and radiation. And then she got COVID and she just spent years being very sick and not writing poetry. But in her last months of life, she started hearing her poems in her head again. And so that was something that she started telling me, like, my poems are back, like I can hear them in my head. But she was too weak and she couldn't document her poems anymore. So I was like, well, you get those poems out of your head. Like, let's start documenting these poems. And as she was, telling me her poems and I was writing them down, they were all about her kids. She had two adult children. And so I was like, girl, we gotta make a book about these poems, So I had made two books. She had a son and a daughter. So we made two books, one for her son and one for her daughter. And the poems were just all poems for them about their vacations that they took when they were kids, the house that they grew up in, the Halloween costumes that she made for them. And the kids had no idea that we were working on it. When she did pass away, I went to the funeral and I was able to give the kids these things that they were able to have and cherish forever. So that's the type of legacy projects that we get to work on with our clients while they're still here and then present to their families after they're gone.
Wow, yeah, I have goosebumps listening to all of that. I just think that, I think it's so important. And to your point of death being uncomfortable and people not really wanting to have those conversations or even really reflect and think about their own death. People don't want to do that. That is uncomfortable, And so I think that, yeah, having you there, not only are you a nurse and you understand the dying process, but this is your job, is guiding people through this chapter of life. And your experience alone, I'm sure, comes as a sense of comfort to the patient and the family. And just, for you to take all of that weight off of them and just, let them have those last however many days, I think is so, so huge. So I think it's great. I commend you. I love that you're promoting more and more of this too. And so as far as kind of the next generation of death doulas and bringing more people into this really pivotal part of life, talk to me about the Death Doula School and what you're doing with that.
I quickly realized that there's a lot of people out there that want to do this, that want to do what I'm doing. And I went to a training program to get my death doula training, and it was good, but it was lacking in really preparing people for death and what death really looks like. And since I've kind of, sat bedside for many, many, many deaths as a nurse, I just felt like I wanted to create a really super solid death doula training program to train people to provide the type of support that I am providing. So I created Death Doula School. So Death Doula School is a comprehensive curriculum that trains and certifies people that want to become a death doula. So in order to become a death doula right now, you have to open your own business. There's not really anybody who hires death doulas at the moment because it's kind of a new wave of career type thing. My program teaches people how to open a business as a death doula, but most importantly, it teaches what death looks like and what death sounds like. It teaches the medical aspects of death and dying. And then it teaches people how to really support the dying individual and the loved ones through that. How to work on legacy projects and, really just provide, emotional, spiritual, educational, every kind of support that you could really need. I provide a ton of education about hospice because there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding about everything that hospice is and everything hospice does. And I think that is so important to know as a death doula. I also think it's so important to bridge the gap between hospice and us because I think a lot of times hospice doesn't understand what death doulas are. And so there might be a little bit of weirdness there. And there are some death doula training programs that don't paint hospice in a great light, which I think is not good either, because I think that we work absolutely beautifully together and there's no reason for that. So my program is very much geared towards advocating for everything hospice is and everything hospice does and advocating for us working together because we really work together beautifully. So my program is all online. It's learn at your own pace. I actually have a ton of nurses who have gone through my program because they are just like myself. They've worked in long-term care or they've worked in hospice for a really long time, and they're just interested in providing a different type of care now. And so they've gone through my program. It's all online, learn at your own pace so that you're able to fit it into your life wherever it sees fit. So if you're already working full time, it's not like you have to attend live classes or anything like that. It's about 40 hours of curriculum, and it includes some pretty significant case studies. My mentorship and support kind of goes along with it so that you know that you're getting a good amount of education. And before you graduate and get your certification, there's one-on-ones with me so that I know that you've actually taken in all of the knowledge and education and that you're ready and prepared to kind of hit the ground running before you go out there and start working with people. But yeah, so I started training death doulas. So far, I've graduated about 10 people so far, and I just opened the school in March. So that's not too bad, actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. And people from any background can go through the school?
Yeah, absolutely. So you don't have to have any type of medical background, which is, I think, why I opened my school, because a lot of people who don't have a medical background want to go into this. And that's totally fine. You don't have to have a medical background, but I think that it is so important that you do receive some type of medical training. It doesn't have to be, you obviously don't have to receive a whole nurse's training. You don't need all of that, but you do need to understand the medical aspects of death and dying. The body goes through a lot as it's shutting down. The organs are one by one shutting down, and you're going to see a lot of things. And you're going to hear a lot of things, and it can look differently for people. There can be terminal agitation. There can be terminal lucidity. There's just a lot of different things. And if you don't educate and prepare people for that, then they're going to go into a death ill prepared. And that can be really scary. And sending a death doula into a death situation without being really fully prepared, I think, could be not great. I don't know how they would appropriately support somebody in a really scary situation if they're not really prepared themselves. So that's why I do dive pretty deep into all of the medical stuff. And then also, most of the death doula training programs out there, they don't teach anything about hospice, which I think is just really missing a big important part, because death doulas should know everything that hospice does and they can do. If you're with a client in a situation where something is going wrong and it's something where you need hospice's help, you need to know that so that you can say, I need you to call the hospice nurse. It's just something that you need to know. You need to know when you need hospice and when you don't. And even silly little things like preventing pressure ulcers. I mean, how important is it to prevent a pressure ulcer, especially at the end of life? Because once they develop, they do not heal. You cannot heal a pressure ulcer in somebody who is actively dying. So they're even more important to prevent them than in anybody else. And so, understanding the booties that you can put on somebody's feet and how you can get those from hospice, and the wedges that you can get from hospice, and turning and repositioning, these are just very simple little things that a death doula can understand and can be taught. They just need that education. So all of that stuff is included in my program as well.
Yeah, I love that you bring your clinical background to your course because, to your point, like it's not like what you're doing is not all clinical, but there are physical, clinical things happening in front of you, and you need to be able to partner with other resources available, like hospice, and like work with the medical team to make sure that patient is getting what they need. So I think it's really incredible that you are equipping people without that background with the knowledge that they need to like be successful and really support that patient and the family the best that they can in all aspects throughout that process. And so that is the Death Doula School. Talk to me about the Death Doula Collective.
So the Death Doula Collective is a collective of death doulas from across the whole country. And the reason I started the collective was because I live here in Ohio. And when I opened my company as a death doula, I was the only death doula in my area. And that probably sounds great to people opening a business, like, oh, you got to dominate the market. Well, kind of. It was very lonely. Nobody knew what a death doula was. And I was like, I don't know, this is so hard. And who do I reach out to for help? And how do I market being a death doula? And I just had all of these questions and nobody to really reach out to for help. And so what I did was I went onto Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, and I just started looking for any death doula that I could find, hoping that I could find somebody who would give me some help. What I found was a whole bunch of death doulas who were in the same exact boat as me. They were kind of all alone looking for help, looking for someone else who could help them. So what I decided to do was create a group. Let's create this networking group where we can all get together and we can meet with each other twice a month and help each other grow. So that's what I did. I ended up finding in trying to network with a lot of death doulas that the majority of death doulas were extremely happy to meet each other and to network with each other. But then I found that there was a certain amount of death doulas who were not friendly and did not want to network with each other and wanted to be the one and only death doula. And that's not me. I foster collaboration over competition all the time. And so this gave me even more of a will to open this group because I wanted to empower every death doula that I could find to grow and to be big and to be successful. I have no desire to be one death doula. There's how many people in the world? I can't help all of them. I can't even help all of the people here in my little town, let alone all of the people in the world. There has to be more than me. So I opened the Death Doula Collective with the idea that we are here to empower and support and guide each other in becoming successful. And so that's what we do. We meet twice a month, and sometimes I have guest speakers who will come in and kind of help, teach us how to grow our business, So like I worked with somebody who helped me with marketing and with my messaging and things like that. So I brought her to the collective so that she could teach all of them how to do that too. I've had somebody come in and teach, like, there's a way that death doulas can have their clients pull money out of their life insurance policies to pay for end of life care. So that was something that is obviously important for all death doulas to know because they can, their clients can obviously use that money to pay for them. So I had that person come in and kind of speak to all of the death doulas. But sometimes we don't have a guest speaker and we just talk. What are the hot topics, or what's your biggest problem that you're facing this month? Or sometimes we just chit chat and talk about whatever everyone's wanting to talk about. But it's interesting because we had started the collective in June of last year, 2023. And in that time, almost every single one of us was, kind of grasping at straws, not really making any money, trying to find clients here and there. And we were all just kind of laughing in our last meeting because now we're like so busy that we can't keep up. We've got clients coming in left and right. And so we were all just impressed with ourselves that like we've all come so far in a year. And I mean, I can't credit it all to the collective. It has to do with death doulas as a whole growing. The whole role is growing. It's impressive where we've come in just 1 year's time. So
Absolutely. And I love your philosophy of collaboration over competition. I think I read it somewhere, but it was pretty early on in my entrepreneurial journey that you shouldn't feel threatened by someone, even if they're offering like the same service as you, right? And if you're a local business, even in the same area as you, because that person is going to be right for some clients. Whereas, like you and your story and like your specific experience that you're bringing to the table is going to be right for someone else. And so I think it's important on both sides of the table to have that collaboration so that the people providing the service, they're working together, they're sharing ideas and what's worked and what hasn't, and that's good for the clients. And then the clients have options to choose from, which is always going to be better for the client. Like you want them to be able to choose, especially with something like death and dying, like you want them to be able to choose the person who they feel very comfortable and connected with during, to walk them through that time. So I think what you're doing with that is really impressive. And it's so exciting to hear the amount of growth that everyone's kind of seen in their business in the past year. And obviously, I know that a lot of that must be from the things that you guys are learning and about marketing and communicating your services. But do you feel like, generally speaking, do you feel like people, society as a whole, are more aware of death doulas to begin with, like as a baseline, or the importance of the death and dying process? Or do you think that is still a major shift in baseline understanding that needs to happen?
I think that COVID brought a lot more death awareness to people. A lot of people died all over the place in a small amount of time. And so I think that kind of brought death to the forefront of people's minds a little bit more than we were probably used to. I do believe that I always say I'm kind of at the forefront of the death positive movement because I do believe that more people are now willing to talk about and think about and realize like we are all going to die. I always say 10 out of 10 of us aren't getting out of here alive. And so, whether we talk about it or we don't talk about it, that doesn't change that fact. We are all still going to die, even if we don't talk about it. And there is a generation of us who was taught that it is wrong to talk about death and dying and that you don't talk about death and dying. But that generation of people is aging out and a different generation of people is now taking over. The baby boomers are now getting ready to age out, and the baby boomers are the largest generation of people to age out yet. And the healthcare system is already struggling to manage that, and it's only going to get worse. And so, there's going to have to be something there to buffer that. And I do believe that the baby boomer generation is the first generation that is willing to maybe look at things a little bit differently and think about things a little bit differently. I think the generation before them was very much, we don't talk about death. They're very much, I don't want to hear a word about a death doula. I don't care what a death doula is. Not in my vocabulary. We don't talk about death. But this other generation that's kind of coming up is much more willing to hear about it and to talk about it and to think about it. And I think that might be because, a lot of them had experienced a not so great death experience with their mother or their father or whoever it is. A lot of times when I meet somebody and I explain to them who I am and what I do, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard them say, like, I wish I knew you when my mom was dying or when my dad was dying, like you would have been so helpful. And then the other thing that I think is, I can't tell you how many clients I've had who have hired me who used a birthing doula. And that's why they hired me. And it's sad because those clients are younger clients. A lot of my clients that I work with have terminal diagnoses, but they're younger. They're in their 40s or their early 50s or even their late 30s sometimes. And so they used a birthing doula with their children, and it was just the greatest experience ever. And so they knew now that they're experiencing this other, time in their life, they knew that they wanted a death doula by their side, because I do believe that this just will continue to grow. And I mean, honestly, I feel like I can say without a shadow of a doubt that in 20 years, it will be something that everybody will know of just as much as they know of hospice. I mean, it'll be the type of thing where people will be like, oh, you got to call a death doula. She got a cancer diagnosis. You got to call a death doula. I believe that every single person will know about it in a certain amount of years. It's just a matter of changing the narrative and changing the culture and getting out of that culture that we've always been in. But that's kind of this era that we're in now, right? I mean, we are, as a whole, humans getting out of this, culture of believing these things that we were always taught to be true. We were always taught to believe a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. And now people are kind of, seeing things to be different. So I do believe that this death positive culture will just continue to grow, and people will continue to make end of life decisions and have end of life talks. And it is my hope that we won't necessarily think of death as so scary and such a hush hush thing anymore in the near future.
Absolutely. Well, Kacie, for anyone listening today who might be interested in looking more into this path or maybe even enrolling in your Death Doula School, what advice would you give for any nurses specifically who are considering this path, whether that's actionable steps they can take or maybe just things that they should be considering or reflecting on if they're thinking about going in this direction?
Absolutely. Honestly, if you're considering going in this way, the first thing I would tell you to do is follow me on social media, only because I post content every single day, and that content might just help you decide if this feels like it's right for you. I also have a lot of stuff on my website that can help. So if you go to deathdoulakacie.com, my social media is Death Doula Kacie as well. And I'm on any social media platform that you could think of. I'm on YouTube and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and LinkedIn. I'm on all of them, but I do post a lot of content there. So, I mean, if it's something where you're like, I don't know if this feels right for me, feel free to check me out, because I post a lot of stuff that could really help you kind of determine. I've got a lot of blogs on my website that could help. I have a free webinar on my website that could help, but also I'm very accessible. So, I mean, if it's a type of thing where you're like, I feel like I want to talk to this girl, that's always possible too. So you could go to my website, you could shoot me an email, a message, and we could kind of chat and determine if this is the right path for you.
Amazing. Yeah. And I will put all of that contact information in the show notes as well, so that it's right there at your fingertips. Awesome. Well, Kacie, thank you so much for coming on today. I have absolutely loved this discussion, and I hope that this results in some nurses maybe realizing that this is a chapter of life that they could be really impactful in as well. Yeah. Thank you for joining me.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And I agree. I hope some nurses kind of go down this path. And if you're thinking about it, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
To connect with Kacie after today's show, you can find her socials at Death Doula Kacie. You can visit her website at deathdoulakacie.com or reach out to her by email at kacie@deathdoulakacie.com. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to hit subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. And if you were inspired by today's conversation, I hope you'll share this episode with someone who'd love it just as much as you did. If you're ready to pivot your path, visit the job board at jobs.mypivotpath.com. And if you have any questions or just want to say hi, feel free to email me at audrey@mypivotpath.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.